Welcome to Influential Entrepreneurs, bringing you interviews with elite business leaders and experts, sharing tips and strategies for elevating your business to the next level. Here's your host, Mike Saunders.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Influential Entrepreneurs. This is Mike Saunders, the Authority Positioning Coach. Today we have with us Joshua Lindsey, who's the Managing Partner of American Business Brokers. Joshua, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Hey, you're welcome. So I'm looking forward to our conversation because I know that when people start a business, they think, hey, I want to have a thriving business, and that's a big hill to climb in and of itself. But then like we see in Shark Tank, and we go, oh, you're valuing your business at X. Well, how'd you come to that? And I think sometimes we see those blank stares like, well, I don't know. So let's talk all about how businesses can get, the right valuation and if you should sell and when you should sell and mistakes when selling. So I'm excited to jump into that. But first, give us a little bit of your background and what's your entrepreneurial journey been like?
Sure. So my background, I've been in mergers and acquisitions now for about 13 years. My route to get here is a little different than most. I actually started out, I took my first company public in 2006, did a 2-year stint there. It was in the financial services sector. Got out of that, had a little bit of capital, and started acquiring businesses myself. So in total, I've sold 6 of my own personal companies. And throughout that process, I had a lot of friends and family asking me, hey, how are you doing this? Or how are you coming up with the valuations? Or where are you finding the money in order to exit? And so that was kind of the birth of American Business Brokers. Was I could see that there was a real need for proper representation from somebody who's actually doing it themselves with their own capital, just in the marketplace. So American Business Brokers, like I said, has been around for about 13 years. That's where we represent sellers of successful businesses and walk them through everything as far as putting together the valuation, marketing the business, going out and finding the money, obviously negotiating and closing the deal and structuring a successful exit. So
I love that intro because it's kind of like, well, when you were going through those 6 businesses that you started, grew, and sold, it would have been nice to have known some of those things. And now you're going, okay, maybe I should just provide that as a service. So that's spectacular. And I also know that, I mentioned Shark Tank. I'm an avid watcher. I think I've watched every episode of every season. And I think that this past episode that I watched, I forget whether it was a repeat or not, but one of the sharks said, you know what? Stop right there. I'm out. And here's the reason that I'm out. You said successful exit from some of the, the advisors that he aligned with. And he goes, if your mindset is successful exit and you're on the front end of your business to grow it, I don't want any part of it because I want you to focus on the business, grow it, and then look at exiting. So my question to you is, when do you feel and when do you advise your clients is the best time to consider selling or exiting a business?
Greg, I think their advice is spot on. You can't go into a business thinking I'm going to sell this because you've got to be all in on building that thing and almost put on blinders that you're going to do whatever it takes in order to make it successful. Now, to answer your question, ironically, the best time to sell is when your business is wildly successful because obviously nobody really wants to buy something that's going down in value, going down in revenue, or market is shifting, etc. It's one of the toughest things that I do in my business is I field calls from people that say, hey, my business is struggling. My numbers are going down, but I spent $300,000 to start this business. Can you help me sell it for $500,000 so I can get my money out of it? And it's like, not really, because, somebody doesn't want to take over your problem. I get it. You put $300,000 into it, but that doesn't. Yeah,
but you might have run into the ground.
You're going to get that out.
It's kind of like saying, hey, I bought this house for $300,000 and I let it go to pot and now it's got a leaky roof and the foundation's horrible, but I want to sell it for $400,000 just because I want to get my money out. Sorry, but the house is not stable. Well, is the business stable? And so when you say, well, the best time to sell is at the peak of or when business is great, are there any indications of when the business is like at a peak? Like, I know there's no earthly way, and I know that's probably a fictitious question because it's kind of like, when should I sell this stock? At the very peak? Well, who in the world knows when the peak is? Anything could topple it. So what are some indicators that you would say, hey, when a business is doing this or trending this way is a good time to maybe look at preparing to sell?
Well, let's talk about the first one. Okay. The first one is the owner. Where are you in your life, right? I mean, if you're in your late 20s or early 30s, you might say, hey, look, I can do this for another 10 to 15 years, no problem. I like what I do. I'm making good money. I still feel like there's growth on the horizon. Timing has to be right for the owner. And most of my clients, or at least a good portion of them, they're looking to transition into something else. Maybe it's retirement, maybe it's another business, maybe it's relocation. But that's usually the first big indicator is timing for the owner. The second would be, and this is a little bit more difficult, but as a business owner, you are an expert in your space, and you need to have the ability to forecast where your business is and will it be viable in the future. For example, I think everybody knows that electric cars are coming. They used to be an idea. Now they're a reality. I think it's pretty easy to say in 10, 15 years, there's going to be a lot of electric cars on the road, right? So do you operate in a space where maybe your business might not be as successful in 10 or 15 years because you're in an industry that might be obsolete? You do have to forecast and try to say, hey, maybe it's a good time to exit now because in 10 or 15 years, my business might not be as needed as it once was. I mean, that's something that a business owner should be thinking about. Because timing is important as far as when to exit.
Yeah. It's all about the timing. And I would venture to say too, that when you're trying to evaluate that timing, you better know what your business is valued at. So yes, you need to know the time to sell, but I would venture to say that if you don't know what your business is valued at, you could think in your mind that it's worth way more than what it is, or even way less. And both of them have equal negative ramifications. So what do you advise your people you work with regarding that?
Yeah, it's a common mistake. Ironically, there's usually somebody in their neighborhood that's always telling them your business is worth $20 million, right? And it's like, look, where did they come up with that number? And if they can sell it for $20 million, then hire them and have them go sell it. But getting a proper valuation involves market research, financial analysis, and a deeper dive. You don't just take a multiple of revenue and apply it to your business and say, yep, that's how you sell it. Anybody that does that has never sold a business, because I can tell you 10 Subway franchises is way different than a tech company. And if you're using the same multiple, you're leaving money on the table on both of them. You're not evaluating it correctly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's kind of like when you think about in marketing, your target market. If you owned a car dealership, your target market is not everyone that drives a car in a 50-mile radius. You've got to then zero in. Well, you've got to figure out what kind of business that you have so that you know the right formula and algorithm and assessments and all of that. So I know that that's part of then what you provide is to say, okay, let's come in and take a look at the sector and your longevity and what are some of the red flags that come up in this kind of business. So how many do you work in specific sectors, or does that matter because you know then how to overlay the right numbers in whatever sector someone is in?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've sold everything from medical device companies to home hospice to logistics to online businesses that have no brick and mortar footprint. It doesn't really matter the space. We've done the deal. The key is you have to do the market research behind the scenes. So if it's tech, you really got to dig into the IP and the patents, right? And that has intrinsic value that's beyond revenue. If it's a Subway franchise, you're probably going to put a lot of effort into that brand, but also the financials of, what are those stores doing and et cetera. So like I said, you can't just treat each business the same. A lot of it has to do with the market research. And then with the follow-up is the business financials. It's very important that you have good books and that you're not jamming a ton of stuff through it that muddies the water, so to speak.
And when you say business financials, you better be focusing on the right things in the right order, because it makes me think about in whatever business that you're in, top line, get more revenue, get more sales. And that's wonderful if you then have that money going to the right places and not flowing right back out of that bucket with holes in it. So do you ever find yourself working with a business that you go, look, where you stand right now, you could get X. But if we could just polish this and tweak that and give it 6 more months, you could get Y. Is that something that you can kind of foresee that way?
Yeah, 100%. And an easy example of that is private equity companies are typically willing to pay more for businesses. They'll pay higher multiples, but they won't even look at stuff usually that's below 2 million in net revenue. I mean, 2 million in profit that's going back to the owner. So let's say you're at $1.2 million, you're probably going to get a lower multiple than if you could get it to $2.5 or $3 million in cash flow. Just because the buyer is going to be a completely different type of buyer.
Yeah.
And those private equity or family office type buyers, they're usually willing to pay a higher multiple if and when there's a higher EBITDA and there's infrastructure in place.
It makes me think of what you just said there from the real estate sector when you hear curb appeal. If you want to have that good first impression, you better have good curb appeal. Well, what you just said there with having some of those, multiples and good profits, and there's certain sections or areas of your financials that you better have some good curb appeal with, so that then when they dig in, they go, okay, well, this is not all that great, but we can overcome it because we've got this good curb appeal.
Yeah, it's a good point. Let me give you an example of curb appeal since you made the analogy. A good example of curb appeal in a business is when the owner is not working 40 to 50 hours a week.
Ooh.
When they've got infrastructure in place and they're overseeing the business, much more appealing to a buyer, and they're usually willing to pay a higher multiple than when they find out, well, yeah, I'm there 40, 50 hours a week, turning a wrench, making it happen, or I'm the main sales guy, I bring in all the revenue. It doesn't mean that your business isn't sellable. It just
that's a job.
might not have as much. Yeah, exactly. It's just a different type of sell. I still sell those type of businesses. They're still great businesses, but a business that is more of a business where the owner oversees it and has infrastructure, again, the curb appeal of that business, much higher.
Well, I mean, that makes logical sense too, because you might find someone coming out of corporate America that wants to buy a business that they can stay active and do. But then you might find someone that just goes, you know what? I've been there, done that. I want to buy a business that actually is a business, and I can come in 3 days a week and meet with the heads of whatever department. I don't want to turn the wrench, quote unquote. So that's a really great point, and I would venture to say that someone thinking of selling their business could be looking at that curb appeal example going, okay, hold up. Maybe I need to put some work in, and maybe I'm going to sell in 1 year. Let's say that was their time frame. You can put some things into place to be working toward that. Maybe it's not perfect, but then maybe you are working toward that so that when they come to you and look at selling, they have that better, a lot more attractive of an offer.
Absolutely. It makes the transition easier. It makes a buyer more comfortable about spending the money, because they're not worried, hey, is this business going to transition and transfer over to me? If you put those things in place, you eliminate that fear, and they'll definitely pay a premium for that.
So what are you finding that are some of the main mistakes business owners make before selling the business? We talked about a couple, like the curb appeal and the numbers, but what's another big one that you see?
Well, let me just reemphasize numbers, because it is the number one thing that I see is when they're not keeping good books. And when I say good books, I'll peel this onion a little bit more. If you're jamming a ton of personal expenses through your business, like, for example, you go out and buy a boat for $70,000 and then you write it off as a marketing expense, well, that's not an allowable add back, okay? Like under the GAAP principles of accounting, you might be able to get away with it by slapping your logo on the boat and, validating it. But when you go to sell, it's just not going to be an allowable add back. They're going to have lawyers and CPAs and people looking at your books. And if they see, a boat as a write-off and you're trying to add that back in, it just muddies the water. So I'm not telling you not to have business expenses, like write off your insurance, life insurance, cell phone, gas. These type of things are all normal. But if you really start jamming a lot of crazy stuff through it, you're dragging the value down of your business. It just doesn't help.
That's a really good point, because it's like where there's smoke, there's fire. If you're doing that kind of thing in that example, then where else is there some landmines in the books or in the business?
Yeah, exactly.
Neat. Okay, so knowing your numbers, that's pretty important. Is there anything that you would advise is the low-hanging fruit? If someone is hearing this going, okay, I'm going to look at selling my business in 12 to 18 months, and so I'm going to look at these things we're talking about, what are some of the low-hanging fruit that they can do to polish things up?
Yeah, like I said, clean up your numbers. If you have the ability to start to replace yourself, putting a manager in place, et cetera. If you're 12 to 18 months out, it should give you enough time to, transition and train. That's definitely going to add a premium value and allow a buyer to feel comfortable to purchase. And then obviously getting a proper appraisal. You can't just slap a number on something and say, this is what it's worth and throw it out there. You better be able to validate and stand behind your asking price. And so, that's part of the preparation is knowing what it's worth and, sticking to that number. And if it's not worth what you want it to be worth, then put together a plan to get it to that number or above it. But don't just guess. Don't just throw it out there and hope it's going to sell. Less than 10% of businesses sell. And I think a lot of that is because people don't know how to properly price them.
Yeah, that's really good. So is that a service that you provide, is helping a business owner see what their business could be assessed or appraised for?
Yeah, absolutely. It's probably one of the key components, but it's absolutely one of the first things that we do when we talk to a business owner is we'll provide them a free appraisal. And the reason being is we want to get on the same page with them as to what their business is worth. And before we decide to work with the client, because we are contingency based, we need to make sure that there's a meeting of the minds. If they want $20 million for their business and we think it's worth $6 million, it's just not a good fit for us. We're not going to do it.
Yeah, that's good. Well, if anyone listening would like to reach out, learn more, connect with you, and maybe get that assessment of their business, what's the best way that they can reach out and connect with you?
Yeah, my direct office line is 866-224-8386, or you can go to our website, which is AmericanBizBrokers.com, and reach out that way. Happy to do a free appraisal for any of your listeners, and especially if they mention your show.
Awesome. Well, Joshua, thanks so much for coming on. It was really wonderful getting to know you and talking about your business.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to Influential Entrepreneurs with Mike Saunders. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show or listen to past episodes, visit www.influentialentrepreneursradio.com.